Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest military decisions in ancient history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year 52 before Christ, Rome's conquest of Gaul ran into a problem. A big one. His name was Vercingetorix. Now Caesar had spent the previous several years doing what Roman generals did best, marching around Gaul with several legions and politely informing tribes that they now belonged to Rome. Some tribes resisted and lost. Some surrendered early and lived slightly longer. And many decided that arguing with men carrying large rectangular shields and very sharp discipline was not worth the effort. So overall, things had been going well. Then Vercingetorix showed up. He was a noble from the Arverni tribe, young, ambitious, and dangerously good at convincing other tribes to cooperate. Which, from the Roman point of view, was extremely rude, because the Gauls usually fought each other almost as often as they fought Rome. Divide and conquer works wonderfully when the dividing part happens naturally, but Vercingetorix ruined that system. Instead of competing with neighbouring tribes, he convinced them to unite against the Romans. Suddenly Gaul wasn't a collection of small problems anymore. It was one large, very motivated problem. And he had another idea that Caesar found deeply annoying. Instead of fighting Roman legions in open battle, Vercingetorix adopted a scorched earth strategy. Villages were burned before the Romans arrived, food supplies destroyed, fields emptied. In other words, if Caesar wanted dinner, he was going to have to bring it with him. This strategy was extremely effective and extremely frustrating. Roman armies were tough, disciplined, and very good at stabbing people in formation. But even the best legionary cannot eat a sword. So for a while, Vercingetorix successfully slowed the Roman advance. The countryside became hostile, empty, and very uncooperative. But then he made a decision that would become famous. He withdrew his army into the fortified hilltop settlement of Alesia. From a defensive perspective, it looked perfect. The town sat on a plateau surrounded by valleys and steep slopes. Natural terrain protected it on nearly every side. Strong walls guarded the entrance. To the Gauls, it looked like a safe stronghold. To Caesar, it looked like a container, and Caesar had a habit of building very effective lids. Now, if you're a Roman general staring at a fortified hilltop city full of rebellious Gauls, you have a few obvious options. You can attack the walls, you can try to storm the gates, or you can stand outside, sigh heavily, and begin a massive construction project. Caesar chose option 3, because here's the thing about attacking fortresses in the ancient world. It's messy. You lose a lot of soldiers, ladders get pushed over, rocks get dropped on your head, and suddenly your glorious campaign turns into a very expensive disaster. Caesar preferred efficiency. So instead of attacking Alesia, he decided to trap it. The plan was simple in theory. Surround the entire hilltop settlement with fortifications, so no one could get in or out. Once the Gauls ran out of food, they would either surrender or try to break out. And when they tried to break out, the Romans would be waiting. This type of siege tactic is called circumvallation, a fancy Latin word meaning, "We are building a wall around you, and you are now our problem." And the Roman army was exceptionally good at building things. Roman soldiers were not just fighters. They were engineers, labourers, carpenters, trench diggers, and part-time architects. Every legionary carried tools along with weapons, which meant when Caesar said, "Let's build 18 kilometres of fortifications," nobody asked follow-up questions. They just started digging. First came the trenches. 2 massive ditches were dug around the entire hill, each several metres wide and deep. One of them was even filled with water diverted from nearby rivers. Because if someone tries to charge you, it's helpful if they first have to swim. Behind the trenches came earthen ramparts, reinforced with wooden palisades. Watchtowers were placed at regular intervals, so Roman soldiers could monitor the entire perimeter. Within weeks, the Romans had constructed a complete ring around Alesia. Inside the city, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched thousands of Roman soldiers calmly building what was essentially a giant cage. And the worst part? They were doing it with remarkable efficiency. No panic, no rushing, just disciplined soldiers digging trenches, raising towers, and quietly surrounding the hill. From the Gauls' perspective, it must have been deeply unsettling, because nothing is quite as terrifying as an enemy who shows up and starts building infrastructure around you. And unfortunately, for Vercingetorix, Caesar was only getting started. By the time the Romans finished the first line of fortifications, Alesia was no longer just a hilltop fortress. It was a hilltop fortress inside a Roman construction project. The line of circumvallation stretched roughly 18 kilometers around the plateau. To put that into perspective, that is the length of a modern half-marathon. Except instead of runners, it was trenches, walls, towers, and very tired legionaries with shovels. First came 2 deep ditches dug in front of the Roman ramparts. Each trench was several meters wide. One of them was filled with water diverted from nearby streams. Because if you are planning to charge Roman defences, it is nice to first fall into a moat. Behind the ditches stood the rampart itself, earth piled high and reinforced with timber. On top of the rampart was a wooden palisade lined with sharpened stakes. Every 25 meters or so, the Romans built watchtowers. These towers gave archers and artillery a perfect vantage point over the surrounding fields. Any Gallic warrior trying to escape the fortress would be extremely visible and extremely regrettable. From above, the Roman camp must have looked like a giant ring tightening around the hill. Inside Alesia, the Gauls watched this happen in real time, which is a strange psychological experience. Imagine sitting in your fortress while the enemy slowly builds a fence around you. Not in panic, not in desperation, just calmly measuring, digging, and hammering, day after day. It is the military equivalent of someone quietly locking every door in your house while maintaining eye contact. And Caesar knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just trapping the enemy physically, he was trapping them mentally. Because once the ring closed, the situation inside Alesia became very clear. Supplies would run out long before Roman patience did. Roman armies had logistics, supply lines, organization. The Gauls had whatever food had been carried into the city. And food disappears quickly when thousands of warriors and civilians are trapped in the same place. Vercingetorix had hoped Alesia would protect him. Instead, it had become a container. But the Gallic leader still had one advantage. Before retreating into the fortress, he had sent riders across Gaul, messengers calling every tribe to send help. And somewhere beyond the hills, a massive relief army was gathering, which meant Caesar's tidy little siege was about to become much more complicated. Because soon, the Romans would no longer be surrounding their enemy. Their enemy would be surrounding them. For a while, Caesar's plan looked perfect. Alesia was surrounded. The Roman walls were rising quickly. Supplies were secure. The Gauls inside the fortress were trapped, watching their situation slowly deteriorate. From a Roman perspective, this was ideal. All they had to do now was wait. And Roman armies were extremely good at waiting when food was on their side. But then the scouts came back with news, the kind of news that makes a general stare silently at the horizon for a few minutes. The Gallic relief army was coming, and it was large, very large. Ancient sources, particularly Caesar himself, claimed the relief force numbered more than 200,000 warriors. Now historians tend to treat ancient numbers with caution, because generals occasionally exaggerated enemy forces, mostly to make their victories look more impressive. But even if the real number was much smaller, the problem remained serious. Caesar had roughly 60,000 soldiers. That included legionaries, cavalry, and auxiliaries, which meant that if the relief army arrived while the Gauls inside Alesia attacked at the same time, the Romans could find themselves in a very uncomfortable position, surrounded by enemies on both sides. Imagine it. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix commands tens of thousands of warriors. Outside the walls, another massive Gallic army approaches, and in between them sits the Roman army, politely occupying the worst possible location. It's like volunteering to be the filling in a battlefield sandwich. For most generals, this would be the moment to abandon the siege and retreat. Caesar did not retreat. Instead, he looked at the problem and decided the solution was obvious. He would build another wall. Yes, another one. Because if you are about to be surrounded by enemies, the logical Roman response is apparently to begin another construction project. This second line of fortifications would face outward, protecting the Roman army from the incoming relief force, which meant Caesar's army would soon stand between two giant walls, one facing the enemy trapped inside Alesia, the other facing the enemy approaching from outside. In other words, Caesar was about to lock himself inside the middle of a battlefield, which sounds insane. But Roman engineering had a way of making insane plans work. So Caesar did what any calm, rational Roman general would do when faced with the possibility of being attacked from two directions. He ordered the construction of another wall. This one faced outward. The Romans called this second line of fortifications contravallation, which essentially means a wall built to protect you from the people trying to rescue the people you already trapped. Latin was very efficient like that. Now Caesar's army stood between two massive defensive systems. The inner wall, facing Alesia, kept Vercingetorix and his warriors locked inside the fortress. The outer wall, facing the countryside, would protect the Romans from the incoming relief army. It was a bold solution, also slightly terrifying, because Caesar had effectively placed his entire army inside a giant ring of fortifications with enemies on both sides. If either wall failed, things could become extremely unpleasant very quickly. But Roman soldiers did not panic. They grabbed their tools. Because once again, the Roman army turned into the most disciplined construction crew in ancient history. The second line stretched even farther than the first. Nearly 21 kilometers of trenches, ramparts, towers, and defensive obstacles were constructed, facing outward toward the open countryside. That meant the total length of Roman fortifications around Alesia now approached 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers. That is not a battlefield. That is urban planning. Trenches were dug first, just like before. Behind them rose earthen walls reinforced with timber. Wooden towers were placed at regular intervals so Roman archers could fire down on approaching attackers. The two defensive rings were connected by Roman camps and supply lines. From above, the entire structure must have looked like a massive double circle carved into the landscape. And right in the middle of those circles sat the Roman army, calmly preparing for one of the strangest battles in military history. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix now faced a grim reality. The Romans had not only surrounded him, they had also prepared for his rescue. And somewhere beyond the hills, the Gallic relief army was marching closer. When they arrived, the Romans would be attacked from two directions at the same time, which meant Caesar had successfully created the world's most dangerous waiting room. Building two walls was impressive, but Caesar knew walls alone were not enough. Because if tens of thousands of Gallic warriors decided to charge those fortifications at the same time, sheer numbers could overwhelm even Roman discipline. So the Romans did what they always did best. They engineered the battlefield itself. In front of the outer walls, Roman soldiers began constructing layers of defensive traps designed to slow, injure, and completely ruin the day of anyone attempting an assault. First came the trenches, deep ditches dug into the earth, wide enough to break the momentum of charging troops. Anyone running toward the Roman ramparts would suddenly find themselves dropping several feet into a muddy obstacle, which is not ideal if someone with a spear is waiting on the other side. Then came the stakes. Thousands of sharpened wooden stakes were driven into the ground at angles. Some were visible, many were hidden. The hidden ones were particularly unpleasant. The Romans dug small pits, placed sharpened stakes at the bottom, and carefully covered them with brush and soil. From a distance, the field looked harmless, until the first warrior stepped forward and discovered gravity. These traps were known by the Romans as lilies, because the sharpened stakes resembled the shape of the flower when seen from above, which is a strangely poetic name for something designed to impale you. And the traps did not stop there. Rows of wooden spikes called kippi were buried with only their sharpened points visible above ground. Anyone trying to advance across the field would find their movement slowed, their formation broken, and their feet suddenly very unhappy. The goal was not just to stop attackers, it was to create chaos, because once an army loses its formation, discipline collapses quickly. Behind these obstacles stood the Roman ramparts and towers, filled with archers, slingers, and artillery. So by the time an attacker reached the wall, he would already have fallen into trenches, stepped on hidden spikes, tripped over sharpened stakes, and been shot at repeatedly. In other words, the Romans had transformed the landscape into something less like a battlefield, and more like a very large obstacle course designed by people who disliked invaders. It was brutal, it was methodical, and it meant that when the Gallic relief army finally arrived, they would not just face Roman soldiers, they would face Roman engineering, which was sometimes even worse. While the Romans were busy turning the countryside into the world's most aggressive construction site, life inside Alesia was becoming increasingly unpleasant, because sieges have a very predictable timeline. First comes confidence, then comes waiting, then comes hunger. When Vercingetorix and his army first withdrew into the fortress, the plan seemed reasonable. The hilltop position was strong. The Romans would struggle to attack the steep slopes, and the Gallic relief army would eventually arrive. All they had to do was hold out. But Caesar had removed the possibility of easy escape, and that meant the real enemy inside Alesia wasn't Roman soldiers, it was food. The fortress contained tens of thousands of warriors, along with civilians who had taken shelter behind the walls. Supplies that might normally last weeks suddenly had to feed an entire trapped population, and food disappears surprisingly fast when thousands of hungry people are involved. Day after day, the Romans continued building, digging, and strengthening their fortifications. From the walls of Alesia, the Gauls could see the siege tightening. No one was coming in. No one was leaving. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Rations were reduced. Animals were slaughtered. Whatever grain had been stored inside the city began to run low, and the situation grew desperate. At some point, the leaders inside Alesia made a brutal decision. The non-combatants would have to leave. Women, children, and elderly civilians were sent out of the city in the hope that the Romans would allow them to pass through the siege lines and find safety. It was a desperate gamble, but Caesar refused. Allowing them through would weaken the siege. The Gauls might attempt to escape alongside them. Supplies could potentially be smuggled back in. So the gates of Alesia closed behind the civilians, and the Roman walls remained closed ahead of them. The result was tragic. Thousands of people were left trapped between the two lines of fortifications, unable to return to the city and unable to pass through the Roman defences. It was one of the darkest moments of the siege. Ancient warfare was not gentle, and while Caesar's strategy was militarily brilliant, it came with a brutal human cost. Meanwhile, the Romans kept waiting, because somewhere beyond the hills, the relief army was still coming, and when it arrived, everything would change. Eventually, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Roman scouts began reporting movement beyond the hills surrounding Alesia. Dust clouds on the horizon, columns of warriors approaching from every direction. The Gallic relief army had arrived. For the soldiers inside Alesia, the sight must have felt like salvation. From the walls they could see banners and warbands gathering in the distance. Allies from across Gaul had answered the call. At last, the siege might be broken. For Caesar and his legions, the same sight produced a very different reaction, because now the Roman army was exactly where no army ever wants to be. In the middle. Behind them sat Vercingetorix and the trapped army of Alesia. In front of them stood the newly arrived relief force. 2 enemies, 2 directions, and 1 Roman army caught between them. If the Gauls coordinated their attacks correctly, the Romans could be overwhelmed. It was the nightmare scenario Caesar had anticipated when he ordered the second wall built. And now that nightmare was becoming reality. The Gallic relief army was enormous. Ancient writers described warriors pouring into the valleys around Alesia like a tide. Campfires dotted the hills. Horns echoed through the countryside. The Roman fortifications suddenly looked less like a clever siege and more like a defensive ring holding back a storm. Inside Alesia, morale surged. Vercingetorix knew that if the relief army attacked from outside, while his own warriors attacked from within, the Romans would be forced to fight on two fronts at the same time. Even disciplined legions struggle when enemies are attacking from opposite directions. The plan was simple. The relief army would assault the outer Roman walls. At the same moment, the warriors inside Alesia would launch their own attack against the inner fortifications. The Romans would be squeezed between two massive assaults. If even one section of the Roman line collapsed, the siege would break. Thousands of Gallic warriors would flood through the gap, and suddenly the Roman army would be the one trapped. So now everything depended on the walls, the trenches, the traps, the towers. All the engineering Caesar had ordered in the previous weeks was about to face its first real test. Because the Gallic armies were preparing to attack, from both sides. The first attack came from the outside. At dawn, the Gallic relief army began to move across the valley toward the Roman fortifications. Thousands of warriors advanced in loose formations, shields raised, war horns sounding across the fields. From the Roman towers, the view must have been impressive, also slightly concerning, because no matter how good your walls are, watching a massive army march toward you tends to raise the heart rate. But Roman soldiers had prepared for exactly this moment. As the Gallic warriors advanced, they encountered the first obstacle, the trenches. The front rank suddenly found themselves slowing, bunching together as they tried to cross the deep ditches carved into the earth. And slowing down was the worst thing they could do. From the towers above, Roman archers and slingers opened fire. Arrows began falling into the crowded ranks below. Stones from slings cracked against shields and helmets. Then came the traps. Some warriors tried to move around the trenches only to step into hidden pits. Others tripped over rows of sharpened stakes buried just beneath the soil. Formations broke apart as men stumbled, fell, or tried to help wounded companions. Momentum disappeared. The carefully engineered Roman defences were doing exactly what they were designed to do, turning a fast, powerful assault into a slow and chaotic crawl. Meanwhile, the Roman artillery joined the fight. Ballistae and scorpions, Roman torsion-powered weapons, fired bolts and stones into the advancing Gallic forces. From the walls, legionaries hurled javelins at anyone who managed to reach the outer rampart. The attackers had expected to fight Roman soldiers. Instead, they were fighting the terrain itself. And the terrain was winning. Wave after wave of Gallic warriors tried to break through the defences, but the traps and trenches shattered their coordination. Without formation and momentum, even a large army struggles against organised defenders. By the end of the day, the first assault failed. The Gallic warriors withdrew to regroup. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his men had watched the entire attack from the hilltop walls. They could see the relief army fighting below, but the Roman defences held. The siege was not broken, but the Gauls were not finished, because the next attack would be far more dangerous. This time the assault would come from both sides at once, and the Romans would have to fight in two directions. After the first assault failed, the Gallic commanders realised something important. Charging Roman fortifications one army at a time was not going to work. The Romans were too disciplined, the defences too well built, and the traps too effective. Even a large force struggled when it had to cross trenches, spikes, and pits while being shot at from towers. So the Gauls changed their strategy. Instead of attacking separately, they would attack together, at the same time, from both sides. The relief army outside Alesia would launch another assault against the outer Roman wall, while Vercingetorix and his warriors inside the fortress would attack the inner fortifications. For the Romans, this was the scenario they had feared from the beginning. Two enemies, two directions, one very long defensive line. When the attack began, the battlefield exploded into chaos. Outside the walls, thousands of Gallic warriors surged forward again, shouting war cries as they crossed the valleys toward the Roman defences. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix ordered his own warriors to attack. Suddenly, Roman soldiers stationed along the inner wall found themselves under assault from the trapped army they had been besieging. At the same time, soldiers along the outer wall were fighting the relief force. Roman legionaries now had to defend both directions. Imagine standing on a defensive wall while enemies charged toward you from the front, and hearing another army shouting behind you. It was exhausting and dangerous. Commanders raced along the lines directing reinforcements to weak points. Horn signals echoed through the camps. Messengers sprinted between towers carrying urgent orders. Despite the pressure, Roman discipline held. Legionaries rotated positions. Units moved where they were needed most. Archers continued firing from towers while infantry held the ramparts. The fortifications helped enormously. Trenches slowed attackers outside. Walls and towers gave defenders protection. Even the traps in the fields continued to break up Gallic formations. But the sheer scale of the assault was overwhelming. For hours, the fighting continued. And gradually, one section of the Roman line began to struggle, because the Gauls had found something Caesar had hoped they would miss. A weak point in the defences, and they were about to throw everything at it. For all their planning, Roman fortifications were still built on real terrain, and terrain has opinions. Around most of Alesia, the Romans had been able to construct deep trenches, strong ramparts, and carefully placed traps. But in one section of the battlefield, the landscape created a problem. A shallow valley cut through the Roman defensive line. It was difficult ground for fortifications. The slope was awkward. The trenches were harder to dig deeply. The wall itself was less imposing than in other sectors. From a distance, it looked like the best place to attack. The Gallic commanders noticed it. Soon, thousands of warriors from the relief army began concentrating in that area. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix inside Alesia ordered his own troops to prepare another assault. The plan was simple. Overwhelm that section of the Roman defences with sheer numbers. If they could break through the outer wall even briefly, the relief army could pour into the Roman camps. Once chaos spread among the legions, the warriors inside Alesia would rush out and join the fight. Suddenly the Romans would be the ones trapped. When the attack began, it was massive. War horns sounded across the valley. Thousands of Gallic warriors surged forward toward the weakened Roman sector. Behind them came ladders, shields, and relentless pressure. At the same time, warriors from inside Alesia launched their own assault against the inner fortifications. The Romans were now under simultaneous attack from both directions, and the weak point was starting to buckle. Roman soldiers in the valley fought desperately to hold the rampart. Arrows flew from the towers. Legionaries hurled javelins into the advancing ranks. But the Gauls kept coming. Wave after wave pressed forward. Some fell into trenches. Others climbed over obstacles. Ladders slammed against the ramparts. For the first time during the siege, the Roman line began to bend. And when a defensive line bends too far, it breaks. Messengers raced to Caesar's command post reporting the situation. The sector in the valley was under enormous pressure. If it collapsed, the entire Roman position could unravel. Because once a gap opened in the wall, thousands of Gallic warriors would flood through. At that moment, Caesar made a decision. He would personally ride to the threatened section, and if necessary, he would lead the defense himself. Because sometimes the general has to enter the fight. When the reports reached Caesar's command post, the situation was becoming critical. The valley sector of the Roman defences was under enormous pressure. Thousands of Gallic warriors were attacking the weakened section of the outer wall, while Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia were launching simultaneous assaults against the inner line. The Romans were being squeezed. For a few tense moments, it looked like the Gallic plan might actually work. But Caesar was not the type of commander who stayed comfortably behind the lines while things fell apart. Instead, he mounted his horse and rode directly toward the most dangerous part of the battlefield. Ancient writers describe him wearing his famous red cloak, which Roman generals often used as a signal of command. From a modern perspective, wearing a bright red cloak while riding into a chaotic battlefield full of angry enemies might not sound like the safest fashion choice. But symbolism mattered. Roman soldiers recognized their commander immediately, and that mattered even more. As Caesar arrived near the threatened sector, he began organizing reinforcements. Fresh units were moved into position. Reserves were ordered forward. Officers were given direct instructions on where to strengthen the line. But Caesar did more than give orders. He made himself visible. He rode along the ramparts where the fighting was most intense, encouraging the soldiers and personally directing the defense. For Roman legionaries, seeing their general on the battlefield was powerful motivation. Caesar had built a reputation for sharing the dangers of his army. He was not a distant commander. He was there. And suddenly, the morale of the Roman soldiers surged. The line that had begun to bend stabilized. Legionaries fought harder. Units held their positions. The attackers still pressed forward in massive numbers, but the defenders were no longer faltering. Meanwhile, Caesar prepared the next move, because holding the wall was not enough. The relief army outside still had enormous numbers, and as long as they kept attacking, the Romans would remain under extreme pressure. To end the battle, Caesar needed to break the attackers themselves, and for that, he had one more card to play: the Roman cavalry. And when those horsemen moved, the balance of the entire battle would shift. By this point in the battle, the situation was hanging on a knife's edge. The Roman defences had barely held against the Gallic assault in the valley. Caesar's arrival had stabilised the line, but the pressure was still immense. Thousands of warriors were still pushing toward the ramparts, hoping that sheer numbers might finally break the Roman position. Caesar understood something critical. If the Gallic relief army continued attacking in waves, the Romans might eventually be worn down. So instead of waiting for the next assault, he decided to do something the Gauls were not expecting. He would attack them. Caesar gathered his cavalry units, which included Roman horsemen, as well as allied Germanic cavalry, who were known for their aggressive fighting style. While the infantry continued holding the walls, the cavalry moved quietly behind the Roman fortifications, preparing to ride around the battlefield. The plan was simple, but bold. Instead of meeting the Gallic army head-on, the cavalry would circle around and strike the enemy from the rear. In ancient warfare, this was devastating. Infantry formations depended on facing the enemy in front of them. Shields, weapons, and formations were designed for forward combat. When soldiers suddenly found attackers behind them, confusion spread quickly, and confusion in battle is extremely dangerous. At Caesar's signal, the cavalry surged forward. They rode out from behind the Roman lines, sweeping around the flanks of the Gallic relief army. Dust rose from the ground as the horsemen accelerated across the open fields. Then they struck. The Gallic warriors, who had been focused on the Roman walls, suddenly realized they were under attack from behind. The carefully coordinated assault began to unravel. Some warriors turned to face the cavalry. Others tried to continue attacking the walls. Units became disorganized as the battlefield filled with shouts, movement, and growing panic. The Romans on the ramparts saw the moment and seized it. Legionaries pushed forward with renewed energy. Missiles rained down from the towers. The defenders, who had been barely holding their ground, suddenly gained the advantage. Within minutes, the Gallic attack began to collapse. And once a large army begins to retreat, the chaos spreads quickly. The relief force started pulling back, which meant the siege of Alesia was about to end. Once the Gallic relief army began to retreat, the entire balance of the battle shifted. In ancient warfare, large armies rarely withdrew in neat, orderly fashion. Once confusion spreads through the ranks, retreat can quickly turn into something much worse. Panic. That is exactly what began to happen across the valleys around Alesia. The Gallic warriors, who had been attacking the Roman fortifications, suddenly found themselves under pressure from multiple directions. Roman cavalry was now harassing their rear, while the soldiers on the walls were pushing back harder than before. The carefully coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. Some Gallic units tried to regroup and fight the cavalry. Others began pulling back toward the hills. Messages between commanders became difficult to deliver as the battlefield filled with movement and noise. What had begun as a powerful assault was now becoming a disorderly retreat, and Caesar saw the opportunity immediately. Roman cavalry continued pressing the fleeing warriors, preventing them from reforming their lines. Meanwhile, the legionaries along the ramparts increased their attacks, throwing javelins and launching missiles at the retreating forces. Once momentum shifts in battle, it is very difficult to reverse. The relief army had come to break the siege. Now it was struggling simply to escape. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched the events unfold from the walls of the fortress. At first they had seen hope, the arrival of allies, the massive attack on Roman defences. But now they could see something very different. The relief army was leaving. The Gauls outside the walls were withdrawing across the countryside, chased by Roman cavalry. And with that retreat, the last realistic chance of breaking the siege disappeared. Inside the city, the situation had already been desperate. Food was nearly gone. The population was exhausted from weeks of waiting and hunger. Now the final hope of rescue was fading on the horizon. The Roman walls still stood. The relief army was gone. And Alesia was still surrounded. For Vercingetorix, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The siege was over. All that remained was the decision of how it would end. The morning after the relief army retreated, Alesia was quiet. Too quiet. For weeks the fortress had been filled with tension, hunger, and the constant expectation of battle. But now the noise of war had faded. The Gallic army outside had vanished into the hills, and the Roman walls still surrounded the city on every side. Inside Alesia, the reality was impossible to ignore. There would be no rescue. The food was gone. The relief army had failed. The Roman fortifications were intact, and the soldiers guarding them were not going anywhere. The siege had done its work. At this point, Vercingetorix made his final decision. Ancient writers describe the moment with a certain dramatic flair. According to tradition, the Gallic leader mounted his horse, put on his armour, and rode out of the gates of Alesia toward the Roman camp. He approached Caesar slowly, surrounded by Roman soldiers who had spent weeks fighting his army. Then he dismounted. Vercingetorix laid down his weapons and surrendered. Some versions of the story say he placed his armour at Caesar's feet before sitting silently in the dust. Whether every detail happened exactly that way is debated, but the symbolism is clear. The leader of the Gallic rebellion had accepted defeat. For Caesar, the victory was enormous. The rebellion that had threatened Roman control of Gaul was crushed. The tribes that had united under Vercingetorix would soon be forced back into submission, and Caesar's reputation as one of Rome's greatest commanders grew even larger. The siege of Alesia became legendary not just because of the battle itself, but because of the strategy behind it. Caesar had surrounded an enemy army with a massive wall. Then he built another wall facing the opposite direction. Instead of choosing between attack or defence, he did both. And when two Gallic armies tried to crush him between them, the Roman legions held their ground. Sometimes history remembers the loudest battles, but sometimes it remembers the strangest decisions. And building two walls in opposite directions turned out to be one of the smartest moves Caesar ever made. As the sun slipped behind the crooked rooftops of Tudor London, the city did not fall quiet. It simply changed its rhythm. The merchants packed their stalls, church bells faded into the evening air, and another world slowly began to stir. Lanterns flickered to life along the streets, shadows stretched across narrow alleys, and doors of taverns and alehouses creaked open to welcome the night. London, in the 16th century, was a city that drank. Water was often unsafe, wine was expensive, and ale was the reliable middle ground. Brewed from barley and lightly fermented, it was consumed by nearly everyone: men, women, servants, labourers, and even children in weaker forms. By evening, Taverns became the natural gathering places where the city's many lives overlapped. Walk down almost any busy street, and you would eventually see the familiar wooden sign hanging over a doorway. Perhaps it showed a painted boar, a swan, or a crown. Literacy was not universal, so tavern signs relied on images rather than words. A traveller who could not read a single letter could still recognise the white hart or the red lion by its painted animal swinging gently in the wind. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with smoke and conversation. The hearth crackled, benches were packed shoulder to shoulder, and the air smelled of roasted meat, spilled ale, wet wool cloaks, and occasionally less pleasant things drifting in from the street. The lighting came mostly from candles and firelight, which meant the corners of the room often stayed conveniently dark, an ideal condition for quiet deals and whispered conversations. Taverns attracted a remarkable mixture of people. Sailors fresh from the Thames docks sat beside travelling merchants. Actors from nearby theatres, like those around Southwark, drank alongside pickpockets who were quietly studying the room. Sometimes even gentlemen or minor nobles slipped in, hoping to hear rumours, gamble, or simply escape the rigid expectations of court life for a few hours. In Tudor London, taverns were not just places to drink. They were the city's unofficial meeting halls. News travelled through them faster than official announcements. Gossip about the royal court could spread across the city in a single night, carried from table to table along with overflowing mugs of ale. And as the night deepened and the lantern light grew softer, the conversations often grew louder and far more dangerous. If you walked into a Tudor tavern expecting a long menu of drinks, you would be disappointed. The choices were simple, but they flowed endlessly. Ale was the star of the evening, and nearly everyone in London drank it daily. In fact, the city's relationship with ale was less a matter of pleasure and more a matter of survival. Water in Tudor London was unreliable at best. The Thames served as a dumping ground for waste, slaughterhouse runoff, and whatever else the growing city produced. Wells were not always clean either. Ale, however, went through the brewing process, which made it far safer to drink. As a result, people consumed it constantly, at breakfast, midday meals, and certainly in taverns after sunset. The ale itself was not quite what modern drinkers might expect. Most Tudor ale was relatively weak, sometimes called small ale, containing only a small amount of alcohol. It was cloudy, slightly sour, and often served in large wooden or pewter mugs. Stronger versions existed, of course, and those were the ones that caused the loud singing, heated arguments, and occasional fistfights later in the evening. Beer, interestingly enough, was considered something of a foreign newcomer during the early Tudor period. Unlike traditional English ale, beer used hops, which helped preserve it longer and gave it a sharper flavour. The technique had arrived from the Low Countries, brought by Dutch and Flemish brewers who settled in England. At first, many Londoners were suspicious of the drink. Some even claimed hops were unhealthy. Eventually, however, practicality won, and beer began to share the tavern tables with ale. Drinking in taverns followed its own social rituals. Customers rarely drank alone. Mugs were shared, rounds were offered, and refusing a drink could sometimes be seen as rude or suspicious. Taverns were social spaces where loyalty, friendship, and reputation were quietly tested with every raised cup. Food was also available, though it was usually simple. Bread, cheese, roasted meats, pies, and sometimes fish appeared on the tables. The goal was not culinary elegance, but stamina. A good meal allowed a person to keep drinking longer without collapsing onto the bench. As the evening progressed, the mugs were refilled again and again. The room grew warmer, the air thicker, and voices louder. Somewhere a group might begin singing a bawdy ballad, while another table argued loudly about politics, trade, or the latest rumour from the royal court. By this point in the night, the tavern was no longer just a place to drink. It had become a living stage where every guest played a role, and where the line between entertainment and trouble was dangerously thin. One of the most remarkable things about Tudor London taverns was not the ale or the smoky rooms. It was the people. Step through the low doorway of a busy alehouse, and you might find half the city gathered inside, all sitting within arm's reach of one another. Closest to the door were often the sailors. London was a river city, and the Thames brought ships from across Europe and beyond. Sailors came ashore with heavy boots, foreign coins, and stories that grew more dramatic with every retelling. After weeks at sea, taverns offered warmth, noise, and the comforting promise that someone else would refill the mug. Not far from them sat the labourers of the city. Dock workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and porters filled the benches after long days of physical work. Their hands were rough, their clothes smelled of sweat and smoke, and their laughter was loud enough to compete with the crackling fireplace. For these men, the tavern was a place to unwind and complain about wages, bosses, and the endless demands of the growing city. But the taverns were not only for the working class. Travelling merchants also gathered there, spreading maps across tables and discussing deals that stretched from London to Antwerp or Venice. News of markets, trade routes, and prices often circulated in taverns long before it reached official channels. Actors were another familiar sight, especially in the districts near the theatres of Southwark. Performers from stages that hosted plays by figures like William Shakespeare often ended their evenings in nearby taverns. After hours of performing heroic kings and tragic lovers, they relaxed over mugs of ale, loudly criticising rival actors or joking about the audiences. Of course, where there were crowds and coins, there were also thieves. Pickpockets quietly drifted through taverns, studying which patrons were the most distracted. A sailor celebrating too enthusiastically, or a merchant flashing his purse too openly, might soon discover that London hospitality had its limits. Even the occasional gentleman or minor noble might appear. Some came in disguise, eager to experience the lively chaos of the tavern without the rigid etiquette of court life. Others came simply to listen. Taverns were perfect places to hear gossip about politics, royal decisions, or the latest scandal spreading through London. By midnight, the tavern was a strange mixture of worlds. Honest workers, ambitious traders, theatrical dreamers, criminals and curious nobles all shared the same smoky air. And in that crowded room, alliances could form just as easily as trouble. Step inside a Tudor tavern on a busy evening, and the first thing you would notice was not the people. It was the atmosphere. The room itself seemed alive. Firelight danced along dark wooden beams, candles flickered on crowded tables, and a thick haze of smoke drifted slowly beneath the ceiling. Most taverns were not large buildings. Many were converted houses or small purpose-built structures squeezed into London's narrow streets. The ceilings were low, the floors uneven, and the walls often darkened by years of smoke from the hearth. Windows were small and rarely opened during colder months, which meant that once the room filled with customers, the air quickly became heavy with warmth, smoke, and the unmistakable smell of spilled ale. At the centre of the room usually stood a large fireplace. This hearth served several purposes. It provided light, warmth, and sometimes a place where simple food could be cooked. Meat might roast slowly over the fire while pots of stew bubbled nearby. The glow from the flames cast shifting shadows across the room, giving everything a slightly dramatic appearance, as if the entire tavern were part of a theatre stage. And the noise was constant. Conversations overlapped in every corner. Sailors shouted stories over each other while merchants debated trade prices. Dice clattered across wooden tables as gamblers leaned forward, studying the roll with intense concentration. Somewhere near the door, a group might burst into a rough drinking song, their voices slightly out of tune but enthusiastically loud. Occasionally someone produced a small instrument, a lute, a pipe, or a fiddle, and music filled the room. These impromptu performances were rarely polished, but that hardly mattered. The goal was entertainment, not perfection. The tavern keeper moved constantly through this chaos. His job was part innkeeper, part referee. He served drinks, collected coins, settled small arguments, and kept an eye on anyone who seemed likely to start a fight. A good tavern keeper knew his regular customers well and could sense trouble long before the first punch was thrown. Behind the counter stood barrels of ale stacked carefully along the wall. Each mug filled from those casks carried the same promise: warmth, company, and perhaps a little too much courage. As the evening deepened, the candles burned lower and the laughter grew louder. The tavern had become its own world, a smoky island of noise and fire in the middle of London's dark streets. And like many lively worlds, it balanced constantly between celebration and chaos. By the time the candles had burned halfway down and several rounds of ale had been poured, the mood inside a Tudor tavern often shifted from simple drinking to entertainment. Taverns were not quiet places where people politely sipped their drinks. They were lively arenas of games, wagers, and risky amusement. One of the most common sounds you might hear was the clatter of dice against a wooden table. Dice games were wildly popular in Tudor London. They required almost no equipment, could be played quickly, and offered the thrilling possibility of sudden profit. Two men might lean over a table while a small crowd gathered around them, watching the cubes tumble across the wood. Coins were placed in the centre before each throw. A lucky roll could double a man's money in seconds. An unlucky one could leave him staring miserably at an empty purse. Cards were another favourite pastime. Playing cards had spread across Europe during the late Middle Ages, and by the Tudor period they were firmly established in tavern culture. Simple games filled the evenings, but these games rarely remained friendly for long. When money entered the picture, tempers often followed. Gambling itself existed in a strange legal position. The authorities did not entirely approve of it, especially when large sums of money were involved. Yet taverns quietly allowed it, because it attracted customers and kept the mugs moving. As long as the wagers remained somewhat controlled, most tavern keepers were willing to look the other way. Of course, not everyone relied on luck alone. Skilled gamblers learned to read their opponents just as carefully as they watched the dice or cards. Some developed reputations as dangerous players, men who seemed almost unnaturally fortunate night after night. Whether this success came from skill, observation, or clever cheating was often a matter of debate. Cheating certainly existed. Marked cards, weighted dice, or subtle hand tricks occasionally turned a fair game into a quiet theft. When such tricks were discovered, the results were rarely pleasant. A shouting match might erupt, benches could be overturned, and fists would soon follow. Yet gambling was only one part of tavern entertainment. Storytelling competitions, drinking challenges, and bawdy songs were equally common. A group of regulars might challenge one another to see who could finish the strongest ale without losing their balance, or their dignity. These games gave taverns their unpredictable energy. At one table, laughter echoed across the room as a lucky gambler celebrated his winnings. At another, a man stared grimly at the empty space where his coins had once been. And somewhere nearby, someone was always ready to turn a simple game into a very serious dispute. In Tudor London, taverns were far more than places to drink or gamble. They were information centres. Long before newspapers existed, and long before official announcements reached the public, news travelled through taverns like wildfire. A traveller arriving from another town might step into a tavern simply to warm himself by the fire. Within minutes, curious patrons would begin asking questions. What was happening on the roads? Were the harvests good? Had there been fighting anywhere? News passed from mouth to mouth, changing slightly with every retelling. Merchants were often the most valuable sources of information. Many travelled across England, or even across Europe, bringing stories of distant markets and political tensions. Over mugs of ale, they described trade routes, rising prices, and rumours from royal courts abroad. These conversations could shape business decisions across the city. But perhaps the most eagerly discussed topic in any Tudor tavern was the royal court. During the reign of rulers like Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I, England experienced dramatic political shifts. Marriages, executions, religious changes and rivalries among nobles constantly fueled public curiosity. Londoners were hungry for gossip about what was happening behind palace walls, and taverns were the perfect place for such gossip to spread. One patron might claim that a powerful noble had fallen out of favour with the king. Another might whisper that a new alliance was forming in secret. Someone else might insist they had heard that the crown was planning new taxes or preparing for war. Most of these stories were unreliable. Some were wildly exaggerated. Others were entirely invented after a few too many drinks. Yet occasionally, hidden within the noise of rumours, a piece of genuine information emerged. Because of this, taverns sometimes attracted listeners who were far more interested in information than in ale. Government informants quietly visited certain establishments, pretending to be ordinary customers while carefully noting suspicious conversations. Political conspirators also used taverns as meeting places, knowing that a crowded room provided excellent cover for secret discussions. In such a noisy environment, two men leaning close together in a shadowy corner could discuss matters that might cost them their lives if discovered. To the casual observer, the tavern appeared to be a simple place of laughter and drinking. But beneath the cheerful chaos, words carried weight. A careless comment could spark a rumour that travelled across the city by morning. And sometimes those rumours could change the course of history. By the late 16th century, another lively group had begun filling the taverns of London each night. Actors, playwrights, musicians, and theatre workers. The districts south of the Thames, especially Southwark, had become home to some of England's first permanent playhouses. And wherever theatres appeared, taverns were never far behind. After performances ended, actors often walked directly from the stage to the nearest alehouse. The excitement of the evening did not simply vanish when the curtain fell. Instead, it moved across the street into smoky rooms filled with applause, laughter, and the occasional argument about who had delivered the best performance. Among the most famous figures connected to this world was William Shakespeare, whose plays were performed in London theatres such as the famous Globe Theatre. Actors from these stages were regular visitors to nearby taverns, where they relaxed after long hours under the public eye. These gatherings could become lively very quickly. Actors were natural storytellers, and taverns provided the perfect audience. A performer might stand on a bench and reenact a scene from the evening's play, exaggerating gestures and voices to make the room erupt with laughter. Others told stories about difficult audiences, forgotten lines, or costumes that had fallen apart mid-performance. Playwrights also joined these gatherings, listening carefully to reactions. Taverns offered a rare chance to hear what ordinary Londoners thought about the latest plays. If a joke from a performance had made the audience laugh, the writer would certainly hear about it again over ale. If a speech had bored the crowd, the criticism might be repeated just as loudly. Of course, the theatre world had its rivalries. Actors from competing companies sometimes crossed paths in the same tavern, and friendly debate could quickly turn into heated disagreement. Whose troupe was the best? Which playhouse had the finest actors? These questions were rarely settled calmly. Yet taverns were also places of creativity. New ideas for plays were sometimes born in these noisy rooms. A clever phrase overheard at a table, an unusual story told by a traveller, or even a dramatic tavern argument might later appear on stage in some altered form. In this way, the taverns of Tudor London quietly shaped the cultural life of the city. Between the clinking mugs and smoky candles, stories were constantly being created, and sometimes the line between the stage and the tavern became surprisingly thin. For all their laughter and storytelling, Tudor taverns also carried a reputation for danger. A room filled with alcohol, crowded benches, and strong personalities could easily slide from cheerful noise into outright chaos. Fights were perhaps the most common trouble. They rarely began with serious intent. More often it started with a careless insult, a disputed gambling result, or someone spilling a mug of ale onto the wrong person. A few heated words would be exchanged. Voices rose. Chairs scraped across the floor, and within moments, fists were flying. These brawls were usually messy rather than deadly. Punches landed wildly, benches tipped over, and nearby drinkers scrambled to protect their mugs from the commotion. Sometimes the tavern keeper and a few calmer patrons managed to separate the fighters before serious injuries occurred. Other times the struggle spilled out into the street, where it continued under the dim glow of lanterns. Weapons made these situations far more dangerous. Many men in Tudor London carried knives or short daggers. What began as a drunken argument could quickly become a violent confrontation if someone reached for a blade. Authorities worried constantly about taverns turning into breeding grounds for crime. And crime certainly found its way inside these walls. Pickpockets worked carefully through crowded taverns, watching for moments when customers were distracted by games or conversations. A purse hanging loosely from a belt could disappear in seconds. Some thieves worked alone, slipping silently through the crowd. Others operated in small groups, distracting a victim while an accomplice quietly removed his coins. More organised criminals also used taverns as meeting points. Smugglers, fences dealing in stolen goods, and shady middlemen often preferred noisy alehouses for business discussions. The crowd provided cover, and no one paid much attention to two men quietly discussing a suspicious trade in the corner. Because of this, local authorities sometimes kept a watchful eye on popular taverns. Constables might patrol the streets nearby, especially later in the night when the most trouble tended to occur. Occasionally they entered taverns themselves, hoping to catch criminals in the act. Yet taverns remained open and busy despite these risks. Londoners accepted the occasional fight or theft as part of the atmosphere. After all, a lively tavern was always a little unpredictable. And that unpredictability was exactly what kept people coming back night after night. As the night crept toward its final hours, even the liveliest Tudor taverns began to slow. The fire burned lower in the hearth, candles melted into small pools of wax, and the once roaring room gradually softened into tired conversation and scattered laughter. By this point, many customers had already left, stumbling into the narrow streets of London with unsteady steps. Sailors headed back toward the docks. Labourers returned to cramped homes where morning work would arrive far too soon. A few unlucky gamblers walked away poorer than when they arrived, silently calculating how they might explain the missing coins. Inside the tavern, the last guests lingered over their mugs. These late-night conversations often took on a different tone. The loud arguments and singing had mostly faded. Instead, small groups spoke quietly about their worries, ambitions, or regrets. A merchant might discuss an uncertain trade voyage. A young actor might dream about performing before the royal court someday. A weary craftsman might simply enjoy a final moment of warmth before returning to the cold streets outside. The tavern keeper, meanwhile, began the long process of closing for the night. Empty mugs were collected from tables. Spilled ale was wiped from the floor. The remaining candles were snuffed out one by one. The barrels were checked and sealed, ready for the next evening's crowds. Outside, London itself was growing quieter. The great city that had roared with noise only hours earlier now rested beneath a thin layer of mist rising from the Thames. Night watchmen walked the streets with lanterns, calling out the hour and keeping a cautious eye on any lingering troublemakers. Eventually, the tavern keeper reached the door. One final glance around the room confirmed that the benches were empty and the hearth had been safely reduced to glowing embers. The heavy wooden door was pulled shut, the latch secured, and the sign outside creaked gently in the night breeze. For a few hours, the tavern would sleep. But only for a little while. Because in Tudor London, these taverns were more than simple drinking establishments. They were the beating heart of the city's social life. Within their smoky walls, friendships were formed, rumours were born, business deals were made, and sometimes history quietly shifted direction. And when the next sunset arrived, the doors would open again, ready for another night of ale, laughter, gossip, and the unpredictable drama of London life. In the medieval imagination, a knight was supposed to be the very picture of strength. He wore polished armour, rode a powerful horse, and charged into battle beneath banners and trumpets. Knights were symbols of courage, prestige, and noble warfare. But the knights of the Order of St. Lazarus lived a life that looked very different from this romantic image. Their story began not on a battlefield, but in a hospital. During the 12th century, the Crusader states established a network of hospitals in the Holy Land to care for pilgrims and wounded soldiers. Among them stood a hospital in Jerusalem dedicated to St. Lazarus, the biblical figure associated with sickness and miraculous healing. This institution had a very particular purpose. It cared for victims of one of the most feared diseases of the medieval world, leprosy. Leprosy terrified medieval society. The disease slowly damaged the skin, nerves, and limbs, often leading to disfigurement. Because people believed it spread easily, those diagnosed with it were often separated from their communities. Many were forced to live in isolated hospitals or leper houses far from towns and cities. The Hospital of St. Lazarus became one such refuge. Within its walls lived not only ordinary patients, but also knights who had once fought in the Crusades. Some of these men had contracted leprosy during military campaigns in the harsh climate of the eastern Mediterranean. Returning home was often impossible. Society feared them, and many communities refused to accept anyone carrying the disease. But these knights refused to abandon their identity as warriors. Instead, they formed a new brotherhood within the hospital. They took religious vows similar to those of other crusading orders and organized themselves under a military structure. Thus emerged one of the most unusual orders of the Crusader world, the Knights of St. Lazarus. Their lives combined two roles that seemed almost contradictory. They lived as monks, following daily prayers and religious discipline. At the same time, they remained knights, training with weapons and preparing for battle when necessary. Yet their existence carried a heavy burden. Unlike other knights who gained glory in tournaments and crusades, these men lived under the shadow of disease. Their illness marked them as outsiders in medieval society. Even among crusaders, they often faced quiet fear or uncomfortable distance. And still, despite the isolation and the suffering, the Knights of St. Lazarus continued to serve. They cared for the sick, defended the Crusader states when needed, and created a brotherhood where men rejected by society could still live with purpose, dignity, and faith. For the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus, daily life began long before the sun rose over Jerusalem. Like many religious orders of the medieval world, their day started with prayer. In the quiet hours of early morning, the brothers gathered in the chapel, their voices echoing softly through the stone halls as they recited psalms and prayers. Faith was not simply a ritual for these men. For many, it was the foundation that allowed them to endure both illness and isolation. After prayer came the practical duties of the hospital. The Order of St. Lazarus was responsible for caring for those suffering from leprosy, and this work required constant attention. Patients needed help dressing wounds, cleaning infected sores, and managing the slow physical decline caused by the disease. Medieval medicine had little ability to cure leprosy, but care and compassion could ease the suffering of those living with it. The knights themselves often assisted in this work. Unlike most hospitals of the time, where the sick were treated by separate attendants, many members of the order were also patients. Some knights had only mild symptoms, while others were further along in the disease. Yet within the order, their illness did not strip them of dignity or status. They remained brothers, sharing both responsibility and hardship. Despite living in a hospital, the order never abandoned its martial identity. Training continued whenever possible. Those knights still strong enough practiced with swords, lances and shields in courtyards within the complex. Discipline remained strict. The order followed rules similar to those of other Crusader brotherhoods, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, emphasizing obedience, communal life, and religious devotion. Meals were taken together in a shared hall, usually simple but nourishing. Bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat formed the foundation of their diet. Conversation during meals was often quiet, sometimes accompanied by readings from religious texts. Yet beneath the routine, every knight lived with the same uncertain reality. Leprosy progressed slowly, but relentlessly. Some men could serve actively for years before the disease weakened them. Others declined far more quickly. The hospital was not only a place of service, but also a place where many would eventually face death. Still, within these walls, the Knights of St. Lazarus found something that much of medieval society denied them. They found brotherhood. and that brotherhood gave meaning to lives that might otherwise have been defined only by illness. At first glance, the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus seemed unlikely warriors. They lived in hospitals, cared for the sick, and many among them suffered from leprosy themselves. Yet despite this, the order maintained a strong military identity and occasionally took part in the brutal conflicts of the Crusader world. The Crusader states in the Holy Land constantly faced threats from powerful neighbouring forces. Warfare was a regular part of life, and every available knight could become valuable in times of crisis. Even the brothers of St. Lazarus, marked by illness, were sometimes called upon to fight. When this happened, the knights prepared themselves like any other Crusader order. They wore armour, carried shields bearing the green cross associated with their brotherhood, and mounted horses for battle. Many had once been experienced warriors before their illness, and their training did not disappear simply because they had entered a hospital. To other soldiers, however, their presence could be unsettling. Leprosy carried enormous fear in medieval society. Some people believed it was a punishment from God, while others thought it spread easily through simple contact. Seeing knights marked by the disease riding into battle created a strange mixture of admiration and unease among their allies. Yet these men often fought with remarkable determination. For many members of the order, battle carried a certain tragic logic. Unlike other knights, they knew their lives would likely be shortened by illness. Because of this, they sometimes fought with a level of fearlessness that astonished their companions. The risks of war seemed less frightening when one was already living under the shadow of disease. One of the most dramatic moments involving the order occurred during the struggles of the Crusader states against the forces of Saladin in the late 12th century. During these turbulent years, the Knights of St. Lazarus joined other crusading forces in defending Christian territories. Their numbers were never large, but their reputation for courage grew steadily. Medieval chronicles sometimes described them as knights, who had already faced death and therefore fought without hesitation. Whether this was entirely true or partly romantic exaggeration is difficult to know. What is clear is that the order maintained its role as both caregivers and warriors. In the strange world of the Crusades, the Knights of St. Lazarus stood as a reminder that knighthood was not always defined by physical perfection. Sometimes it was defined by resilience. Even within the strange and complex world of the Crusader states, the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus lived under a shadow that few others experienced. Leprosy was not simply a medical condition in the medieval world. It carried deep social stigma. People believed the disease could spread through touch, shared objects, or even proximity. Because of this fear, those who showed signs of the illness were often forced into isolation. Many lepers were required to live outside city walls or in special hospitals far from ordinary society. For the Knights of St. Lazarus, this meant living in a strange middle ground. They were still members of a respected religious order, yet they remained separated from much of the world around them. Even fellow crusaders sometimes kept their distance, unsure how dangerous the disease truly was. Visitors entering the hospital of St. Lazarus might notice this separation immediately. The buildings were often placed slightly apart from crowded areas. Patients and members of the order lived within the complex, rarely leaving except when necessary. Within these walls they formed their own small society, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding. The isolation could be emotionally difficult. Many knights had once lived very different lives before joining the order. They had ridden across Europe, attended courts, and fought alongside other warriors. Now they lived in a quieter world of prayer, hospital care, and limited contact with outsiders. Letters from family members sometimes arrived from distant homelands, but visits were rare. Fear of infection discouraged most people from approaching the hospital too closely. Even when Knights of the Order travelled or joined military campaigns, their illness marked them in the eyes of others. Medieval documents suggest that some brothers of the Order wore distinctive clothing or crosses, identifying them as members of St. Lazarus. These symbols served both as a sign of religious identity and as a quiet warning that the wearer belonged to a community associated with disease. Yet within the order itself, the atmosphere was very different. Inside the walls of their hospital, the knights were not treated as outcasts. They were brothers, bound by vows and shared faith. Their illness did not erase their dignity or their purpose. And perhaps that sense of belonging was the most powerful medicine the order could offer in a world that often turned away from the sick. Life for the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus was not chaotic or loosely organized. Like many religious military brotherhoods of the medieval world, their existence was governed by a strict set of rules that shaped every part of their daily lives. These rules resembled those followed by other crusading orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The Brothers of St. Lazarus lived under vows of obedience, poverty, and religious devotion, combining the discipline of monks with the structure of a military unit. At the head of the order stood the Master. The Master governed the community, organized its military responsibilities, and ensured that the rules were followed. Beneath him were various officers responsible for managing the hospital, supplies, and the daily organization of the Brotherhood. Every knight had a defined role within the order, which helped maintain stability in a community where illness was always present. Discipline was taken seriously. The knights were expected to live modestly. Personal wealth was discouraged, and possessions were often shared communally. Clothing was simple, usually consisting of a dark robe or tunic marked by the green cross associated with St. Lazarus. Armour and weapons were maintained carefully, but used only when necessary. Meals were also governed by the rule. The brothers gathered together in a common dining hall where food was distributed equally. Meals were simple by the standards of medieval nobility: bread, vegetables, sometimes fish or meat, and watered wine or ale. Silence was often observed while eating, broken only by readings from religious texts that reminded the knights of their spiritual duties. Prayer structured the day. Several times each day, the brothers assembled in the chapel to pray together. These moments reinforced the spiritual purpose of the order. Caring for the sick and living with illness were seen not merely as practical tasks, but as acts of devotion. Yet the rule also acknowledged the unique situation of the order. Unlike other religious communities, many of its members were physically weakened by disease. Duties were often adjusted depending on a brother's health. Those still strong enough might assist with training or defense. Others focused on hospital care or administrative work. Through this structured life, the order created stability in a world that could otherwise feel uncertain and fragile. The rule gave the knights something powerful, a sense that even in the presence of illness, their lives still followed a meaningful path. The world surrounding the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus was rarely peaceful. Their hospitals and monasteries existed in the heart of the Crusader states, territories constantly threatened by war. For the Brothers of St. Lazarus, the distant sound of battle was never very far away. The Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land had been founded after the First Crusade in the late 11th century. European knights carved out Christian states in cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli. But these territories were fragile. They were surrounded by powerful Muslim rulers who sought to reclaim the lands that Crusaders had taken. Because of this, warfare became a regular part of life. Military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller played crucial roles in defending these territories. They built fortresses, guarded roads, and fought in major battles across the region. The Knights of St. Lazarus existed alongside these more famous orders. Although their main mission focused on caring for the sick, they still belonged to the broader world of crusading knighthood. When danger threatened nearby settlements or Crusader armies required additional support, members of the order sometimes joined the fight. Yet their position in this world remained unusual. Unlike the Templars or Hospitallers, the Knights of St. Lazarus rarely commanded large forces or controlled powerful castles. Their numbers were smaller, and many of their members were already weakened by illness. This limited their ability to participate in large military campaigns. Still, the order was deeply connected to the events unfolding around them. When Crusader armies marched, news of battles quickly reached the hospitals of St. Lazarus. Victories brought relief and celebration. Defeats brought wounded soldiers, fear, and the grim knowledge that the fragile Crusader states might not survive much longer. One of the most dramatic turning points came during the rise of the powerful Muslim leader Saladin. His campaigns in the late 12th century gradually weakened the Crusader kingdoms and eventually led to the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. For the Knights of St. Lazarus, this moment was deeply significant. Their original hospital and headquarters were located in Jerusalem itself. When the city fell, the order faced the painful reality that the very place where their brotherhood had been born was now lost. And with that loss, their long struggle to survive in a changing world truly began. The year 1187 changed everything for the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus, when the forces of Saladin defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and soon after captured Jerusalem. The entire structure of the Crusader states began to collapse. Cities that had once been strongholds of Crusader power suddenly faced a new political reality. For the Order of St. Lazarus, the fall of Jerusalem was especially devastating. The Hospital of St. Lazarus in the city had been the spiritual and administrative heart of the order. It was where the Brotherhood had first formed, where knights and patients lived together, and where their unique mission of care and service had developed. Losing Jerusalem meant losing their home. Many members of the order were forced to leave the city as the new rulers established control. The brothers who escaped joined the broader movement of crusaders retreating toward the remaining Christian strongholds along the Mediterranean coast. The order eventually relocated its headquarters to the city of Acre, which had become one of the most important crusader ports in the region. Acre served as a gateway between Europe and the remaining Crusader territories. Ships arrived constantly, carrying pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and supplies. For the Knights of St. Lazarus, this new location allowed them to continue their mission. Hospitals were re-established to care for the sick and wounded, arriving from both military campaigns and long sea voyages. Leprosy remained a constant presence in the medieval world, and the order continued to provide one of the few places where those suffering from the disease could find organized care. Yet the order's situation had become far more uncertain. The Crusader states were shrinking. One by one, cities and fortresses were lost. Each defeat meant fewer safe territories where Christian military orders could operate. The Brothers of St. Lazarus now lived in a world where survival depended on constant adaptation. Despite these challenges, the order endured. Knights still trained when possible. The hospital still cared for patients. The daily prayers continued to echo through the halls of their new headquarters. But everyone understood that the age of Crusader dominance in the Holy Land was fading, and the Knights of St. Lazarus would soon face an even greater test, one that would force them to leave the Crusader world behind entirely. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states had reached their final chapter. The fragile network of Christian cities along the eastern Mediterranean had been shrinking for decades, and the pressure from surrounding powers grew stronger every year. For the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus, the situation became increasingly desperate. After relocating from Jerusalem to the port city of Acre, the order had managed to continue its work for several generations. Acre became the last major centre of Crusader power in the region. Pilgrims from Europe arrived there, merchants traded in its markets, and military orders maintained their headquarters within its walls. But even this final refuge could not last forever. In 1291, powerful armies from the Mamluk Sultanate launched a massive assault on the city. The Siege of Acre was one of the most dramatic and violent battles of the Crusader era. Towers collapsed under relentless attacks, streets filled with fighting, and thousands of defenders struggled desperately to hold the city's walls. Members of several military orders fought in the defence, including knights connected to the Order of St. Lazarus. Yet the outcome was inevitable. After weeks of brutal combat, Acre fell. The loss of the city effectively ended the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Survivors fled by ship across the Mediterranean, carrying with them whatever relics, treasures, and memories they could save. For the Knights of St. Lazarus, this meant abandoning the lands where their order had first been born. the Brotherhood relocated to Europe, where they began establishing new centres of activity. France became particularly important for the Order, and one of their most notable properties was the commandery at Boigny, near Orléans. From there, the Order slowly reorganized itself in a completely different political and cultural environment. Their mission, however, remained familiar. They continued to care for those suffering from leprosy and other illnesses, maintaining hospitals and charitable institutions across parts of Europe. Although they were no longer fighting in crusader campaigns, the spirit of the Order survived through service and religious dedication. The transition was not easy. The loss of the Holy Land meant the end of the world that had originally shaped their identity. But the Knights of St. Lazarus had already endured isolation, illness, and exile before. And once again, they adapted. After leaving the Holy Land, the Knights of the Order of St. Lazarus entered a new phase of their long history. The dramatic age of crusader battles had ended, but the mission of the Order did not disappear with it. Instead, the Brotherhood slowly transformed. In Europe, the Order focused increasingly on its charitable and medical responsibilities. Hospitals connected to St. Lazarus continued to care for those suffering from leprosy and other chronic illnesses. At a time when many communities still feared the disease and often pushed patients into isolation, the Order offered a rare place where the sick could live with dignity and care. France became the centre of the Order's operations. One of its most important headquarters stood at Boigny, near Orléans, where the Grand Master governed the Brotherhood and coordinated its charitable work. From this base, smaller houses and hospitals connected to the Order operated in several regions of Europe. Although the crusading world had disappeared, the identity of the Knights did not vanish completely. Members of the Order still wore the green cross associated with St. Lazarus, a symbol that had represented both their faith and their unusual history. The Order continued to recruit members and maintain its religious structure, though the role of battlefield knights gradually faded as European warfare changed. Over time, the presence of leprosy in Europe began to decline. As the disease became less common, the original mission of caring specifically for lepers slowly evolved into broader charitable activities. Hospitals connected to the Order treated a wider range of illnesses, and some branches of the Brotherhood focused on religious and humanitarian work rather than military service. Yet the legacy of the Order remained unique. Few medieval organizations combined so many different roles. The Knights of St. Lazarus had been monks, caregivers, and warriors at the same time. They had lived in hospitals, yet sometimes rode into battle. They had endured illness that pushed them to the margins of society, while still serving causes larger than themselves. In a world where disease often meant exile and despair, the Order created a community built on faith, discipline, and compassion. Their story reminds us that medieval knighthood was not always about shining armour and battlefield glory. Sometimes it was about courage of a quieter kind, the courage to care for the sick, to live with suffering, and to continue serving others even when the world turned away. Long before perfume became associated with elegant boutiques, luxury brands, and glass bottles on dressing tables, scent belonged to religion. The earliest perfumes were not designed for romance or fashion. They were created for the gods. In the ancient world, fragrance was believed to carry spiritual power. When aromatic plants or resins were burned, the rising smoke was thought to lift prayers toward heaven. Sweet scents drifting through temple halls created an atmosphere that felt sacred and mysterious. In many cultures, the presence of fragrance signaled that a ritual was taking place and that the divine world was being invited into human space. Some of the earliest and most sophisticated perfume traditions developed in ancient Egypt. Egyptian priests became skilled in preparing fragrant substances using ingredients gathered from across Africa and the Near East. Resins such as frankincense and myrrh were among the most valued materials. These substances were harvested from trees in distant lands and transported along long trade routes to Egyptian temples. Once they arrived, the resins were carefully processed. They might be crushed into powders, mixed with oils, or burned as incense. The results filled temple chambers with rich, smoky aromas that were believed to please the gods. Fragrance was considered a sign of divine purity. Statues of deities were often anointed with perfumed oils during rituals, just as living priests were cleansed before entering sacred spaces. In Egyptian belief, good scent represented order, beauty, and divine favor. Unpleasant smells, on the other hand, were associated with decay and chaos. But perfume did not remain limited to temples. Members of Egypt's wealthy classes began using scented oils in everyday life. Noble men and women applied perfumed balms to their skin and hair. During banquets and celebrations, guests sometimes wore small cones of scented wax on their heads. As the wax slowly melted in the warmth of the evening, fragrant oils dripped down and released sweet aromas into the air. Perfume became a subtle symbol of status. The ability to wear fine scents meant access to rare ingredients brought from distant lands. It signaled wealth, refinement, and connection to sacred traditions. From these early beginnings in temple rituals and royal courts, perfume began its long journey through human history. What started as a sacred offering to the gods would eventually become something much more personal, a way for individuals to shape how the world experienced them, through scent. As the use of perfume spread beyond Egyptian temples and royal banquets, other ancient civilizations quickly embraced the power of scent. Fragrance was no longer just a sacred offering to the gods. It became a symbol of refinement, luxury, and personal identity. Among the cultures that eagerly adopted perfume were the ancient Greeks. Greek society placed great value on beauty and physical care, and scented oils became an important part of daily life. Athletes rubbed fragrant oils onto their bodies before competitions, believing the scents enhanced both appearance and confidence. Wealthy citizens often visited special shops where perfumers blended oils infused with flowers, herbs, and spices. Perfume bottles themselves became works of art. Greek craftsmen produced delicate ceramic containers called alabastrons and araballoi, small vessels designed specifically to hold scented oils. These containers were often decorated with painted scenes of mythology, daily life, or athletic contests. The fragrance inside might contain ingredients such as rose, iris, marjoram, or thyme, carefully infused into olive oil. Perfume also carried symbolic meaning. In Greek culture, scent was associated with both pleasure and divine presence. Many temples burned incense during rituals, continuing traditions that had begun centuries earlier in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Sweet fragrance drifting through sacred spaces reminded worshippers that the gods favored purity and beauty. When the Roman world rose to power, the love of perfume grew even stronger. The Romans embraced fragrance with remarkable enthusiasm. Scented oils appeared in nearly every aspect of elite life. Wealthy Romans perfumed their bodies, their clothing, and even the walls of their homes. During large banquets, hosts sometimes filled rooms with incense or sprinkled guests with fragrant water. Perfume became an unmistakable sign of status. Trade routes expanded to meet this growing demand. Exotic ingredients arrived from distant regions of the empire and beyond. Cinnamon and cassia travelled from Asia, frankincense came from southern Arabia, and rare flowers were cultivated specifically for perfumery. Roman writers occasionally criticized this obsession with fragrance. Some moralists complained that excessive perfume reflected decadence and luxury gone too far. Yet criticism did little to slow the trend. By the height of the Roman Empire, perfume had become deeply woven into daily life. It accompanied religious rituals, social gatherings, athletic competitions, and even funerals. Fragrance had evolved from sacred smoke in ancient temples into something more complex, a marker of culture, wealth, and personal expression. While perfume flourished in the Mediterranean world, some of the most important developments in the history of fragrance were happening farther east. In regions stretching from Persia to the Arabian Peninsula and into India, perfume became both a scientific craft and a powerful symbol of culture. The Middle East, in particular, became a center of innovation for perfumery. Arab traders controlled vast networks of trade routes that connected Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. Through these routes came rare aromatic ingredients that were prized throughout the ancient and medieval world. Frankincense, Myrrh, sandalwood, musk, and ambergris travelled thousands of kilometres before reaching bustling markets where perfumers experimented with new combinations. In cities such as Baghdad and Damascus, fragrance became deeply woven into daily life. Markets filled with perfume sellers offered oils, incense, and aromatic powders. The scent of rosewater drifted through courtyards, while merchants displayed glass bottles filled with precious oils. Wealthy households often used perfume not only on the body, but also in homes, clothing, and even letters. One of the most important breakthroughs came during the Islamic Golden Age. The Persian scholar Avicenna developed improved techniques for distillation, allowing perfumers to extract delicate fragrances from flowers more effectively than ever before. One of the most famous results of this innovation was rosewater, which became widely used across the Middle East and eventually Europe. Distillation changed perfumery dramatically. Before this technique, fragrances were usually created by soaking plants in oils or burning resins. Distillation allowed perfumers to capture the pure essence of flowers, producing lighter and more complex scents. This scientific advancement laid the foundation for many modern perfume techniques. Perfume also played an important role in religious and social customs. In Islamic culture, cleanliness and pleasant scent were considered signs of respect and spiritual preparation. Fragrant oils were often used before prayer, while incense and aromatic woods were burned in homes and public gatherings. Musk and amber became especially valued, symbolizing both luxury and refinement. As trade expanded, these innovations slowly traveled west. Perfume knowledge carried by merchants, scholars, and travelers eventually reached medieval Europe. Along with spices, silk, and precious stones, fragrance became another treasure moving along the great trade networks of the world. And with it came new ideas about how scent could shape both culture and identity. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe entered a period where perfume became less common in everyday life. Trade networks weakened, cities shrank, and many of the luxuries that had once circulated through Roman markets became harder to obtain, yet fragrance never completely disappeared. Instead, perfume survived mainly in religious settings and royal courts. In medieval churches, incense remained an essential part of worship. Clouds of fragrant smoke drifted through cathedral halls during ceremonies, symbolizing purification and the presence of the divine. Resins, such as frankincense and myrrh, were burned during Mass, continuing traditions that stretched back to ancient civilizations. Monasteries also played an important role in preserving knowledge about aromatic plants. Monks cultivated herb gardens where they grew lavender, rosemary, sage, and other fragrant herbs. These plants were used not only for scent, but also for medicinal remedies. Medieval medicine often relied on herbs and oils believed to purify the body or protect against illness. Perfume also served a very practical purpose during the Middle Ages. Cities in medieval Europe were crowded and often lacked modern sanitation. Streets could be filled with unpleasant smells from animals, waste, and overcrowded living conditions. Because of this, fragrant herbs and scented oils were sometimes used simply to mask strong odours. People carried small bundles of herbs called posies or pomanders, small containers filled with aromatic materials such as cloves, cinnamon, or dried flowers. These objects were believed to protect the wearer from disease, particularly during outbreaks of plague. During the Crusades, European knights and travellers encountered the advanced perfume traditions of the Middle East. Returning crusaders brought with them exotic spices, scented oils, and new techniques for preparing fragrances. These encounters helped reintroduce perfume into European culture. Gradually, perfume began appearing again in the courts of kings and queens. Nobles used scented oils on their clothing and gloves, while perfumed powders and waters became fashionable among the wealthy. The use of fragrance slowly transformed from a religious ritual into a symbol of refinement and status. By the late medieval period, perfume was once again becoming part of European life. What had survived quietly in monasteries and temples was now returning to palaces and aristocratic households. And soon, in the centuries that followed, perfume would evolve into something even more influential, a powerful tool of fashion and identity in the royal courts of Europe. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, perfume was no longer just a religious tool or a simple way to mask unpleasant smells. It was becoming something more refined, more artistic, and far more fashionable. The renewed interest in science, beauty, and luxury during the Renaissance helped revive many ancient traditions, including the craft of perfumery. Trade across the Mediterranean expanded again, bringing aromatic materials into European markets. Spices and resins arrived from the Middle East and Asia, while flowers grown in European gardens provided new ingredients for perfumers experimenting with scents. Cities such as Venice and Florence became important centres for luxury goods, including perfumes and scented oils. In Renaissance Italy, fragrance became closely connected with personal appearance. Members of the aristocracy perfumed their gloves, clothing, and hair. Small bottles of scented oil appeared in dressing rooms, and perfumed powders were sometimes applied to the body. Fragrance had become an invisible accessory, a subtle way of projecting elegance and status. One of the figures often associated with spreading perfume culture through Europe was Catherine de' Medici. When she left Florence to marry the future French king in the 16th century, she reportedly brought with her a personal perfumer and a collection of scented formulas from Italy. At the French court, perfumes soon became part of aristocratic fashion. Gloves, fans, and even letters were sometimes lightly scented. Perfumers themselves began to gain professional recognition. Instead of simply mixing oils in small workshops, specialized artisans emerged who focused entirely on creating and refining fragrance. These early perfumers experimented with blending floral scents, spices, and resins to produce more complex combinations. During this time, the techniques of distillation that had spread from the Islamic world became widely used in Europe. These methods allowed perfumers to extract delicate aromas from flowers such as roses, orange blossoms, and jasmine. Perfume was also tied closely to hygiene, or at least the Renaissance understanding of it. Bathing habits varied widely during this period, and scented products were sometimes used to create a sense of cleanliness or freshness. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, and scented cloths allowed nobles to carry pleasant fragrance with them throughout the day. By the end of the Renaissance, perfume had clearly moved beyond its sacred origins. It had become a cultural language of elegance and refinement, and nowhere would that language grow louder than in the royal courts of France. By the 17th century, perfume had become more than a luxury. In the royal courts of Europe, especially in France, fragrance turned into an essential part of aristocratic life. It was no longer merely pleasant, it was fashionable, political, and even theatrical. Nowhere was this more visible than at the court of Louis XIV. The king ruled from the magnificent Palace of Versailles, a place famous for its elaborate ceremonies, extravagant clothing, and strict social rituals. Versailles was not just a royal residence, it was a stage where status, beauty, and influence were constantly displayed. Perfume played a major role in this environment. The palace itself was often filled with fragrance. Courtiers wore scented gloves, powdered wigs, and perfumed garments. Rooms were sometimes filled with incense or aromatic herbs to create pleasant atmospheres during gatherings and celebrations. There was also a practical reason for the popularity of perfume. Despite the grandeur of Versailles, sanitation in the 17th century was far from modern standards. Large numbers of people lived and worked inside the palace, and bathing was not as frequent as it would become in later centuries. Perfume helped mask unpleasant smells while adding an air of refinement. Because of this demand, France soon became the centre of European perfumery. The town of Grasse in southern France developed into one of the most important perfume-producing regions in the world. The area's climate allowed farmers to grow large quantities of fragrant flowers such as jasmine, rose, and lavender. Local craftsmen initially produced scented gloves for aristocrats, but over time the industry expanded into full perfume production. Distillation techniques improved, and perfumers experimented with increasingly complex scent combinations. At court, fragrance also carried social meaning. A particular scent could become associated with a powerful noble or royal figure. Wearing a distinctive perfume helped create a personal identity within the crowded world of aristocratic society. In a place where appearance mattered enormously, scent became part of one's reputation. Visitors to Versailles often remarked on the overwhelming mixture of fragrances drifting through its halls. It was a world where politics, luxury, and perfume blended together. And as French culture spread across Europe, so too did the idea that scent could define elegance, power, and personal style. By the 18th and 19th centuries, perfume was no longer limited to royal courts and aristocratic circles. The craft of fragrance had begun transforming into a full industry, supported by expanding trade networks, scientific discoveries, and growing demand from the emerging middle classes of Europe. France remained the centre of this transformation. The town of Grasse, which had originally produced scented gloves for aristocrats, evolved into the heart of European perfumery. Fields surrounding the town filled with roses, jasmine, lavender, and orange blossoms. These flowers were harvested early in the morning when their fragrance was strongest, then processed in workshops where perfumers carefully extracted their aromatic oils. For the first time, perfume production became organized on a larger scale. Techniques improved dramatically during this period. One of the most important developments was the method known as enfleurage, where flower petals were placed on layers of fat to slowly absorb their fragrance. The fat was later processed to extract concentrated scent. This allowed perfumers to capture delicate floral aromas that earlier methods had struggled to preserve. At the same time, distillation technology continued to improve. Perfumers could now isolate different aromatic compounds more precisely. This led to more sophisticated fragrances that combined dozens of ingredients. A perfume was no longer simply rose oil or lavender essence. It became a carefully layered composition of top notes, heart notes, and deeper base scents. Perfume also became increasingly commercial. Shops selling fragrances appeared in major European cities. Elegant bottles, decorative labels, and elaborate packaging turned perfume into a desirable luxury product. People began buying scent not only for personal use, but also as gifts and fashionable accessories. One of the figures who helped shape modern perfumery was Pierre-François Pascal Guerlain. His perfume house created fragrances for European royalty and helped popularize the idea of signature scents. A carefully crafted fragrance could become closely associated with a particular person, event, or era. During the 19th century, chemistry also began influencing perfume creation. Scientists discovered ways to produce synthetic aromatic compounds in laboratories. These new materials allowed perfumers to create scents that did not exist naturally, greatly expanding the possibilities of fragrance design. By the end of the century, perfume had moved far beyond temples and royal courts. It had become an industry, one blending art, science, and commerce into something entirely new. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, perfume entered an entirely new era. What had once been handcrafted mixtures of natural oils and flowers was now becoming something far more complex, shaped by science, fashion, and modern industry. One of the biggest changes came from chemistry. During the late 19th century, scientists began isolating and producing synthetic fragrance molecules in laboratories. These compounds allowed perfumers to create scents that were impossible to obtain directly from nature. Some reproduced natural aromas more cheaply, while others introduced entirely new olfactory experiences that had never existed before. For perfumers, this opened an enormous creative playground. Instead of relying only on roses, lavender, or spices, they could experiment with a vast palette of ingredients. Fragrances became layered and structured, with carefully designed transitions between light opening notes, rich floral centers, and deeper lingering bases. Perfume was also becoming closely linked with modern fashion. In the early 20th century, designers began treating fragrance as an extension of personal style. Clothing defined how someone looked, while perfume defined how they were remembered. A signature scent could create an invisible identity that lingered even after a person had left the room. One of the most influential moments in this transformation came with the launch of a fragrance by the famous fashion designer Coco Chanel. Her perfume, Chanel No. 5, introduced in 1921, changed the perfume world forever. Instead of mimicking a single flower, it used a complex blend of natural and synthetic ingredients to create an abstract scent, something modern, mysterious, and distinctly different from traditional perfumes. The fragrance quickly became one of the most recognizable perfumes in history. Its success demonstrated that perfume could be more than a pleasant smell. It could be part of a brand, a cultural symbol, and a statement of identity. During the 20th century, perfume houses multiplied across Europe and beyond. Companies developed distinctive fragrances aimed at different audiences, occasions, and personalities. Advertising campaigns began to present perfume as something seductive, glamorous, and emotionally powerful. By this point, fragrance had travelled a remarkable path. What began as sacred smoke rising in ancient temples had evolved into a global industry that blended art, chemistry, and storytelling. And yet, the essence of perfume remained the same, an invisible force capable of shaping memory, mood, and identity. Today, perfume is everywhere. It lingers in department stores, floats through city streets, and rests quietly on dressing tables across the world. Yet despite its modern packaging and global industry, perfume still carries echoes of the ancient traditions that first gave it meaning. Scent remains one of the most powerful senses connected to human memory. A single fragrance can instantly transport someone back to a childhood home, a distant country, or a person long forgotten. Scientists have discovered that the brain processes smell very closely to areas associated with emotion and memory. Because of this, perfume often creates experiences that feel deeply personal and almost impossible to describe with words. This emotional power is one reason perfume continues to fascinate people. Modern perfumers treat fragrance almost like composers treat music. A perfume is built in layers, often described as notes. The top notes are the first scents a person notices, light and bright aromas that appear immediately after application. Beneath them lie the heart notes, the main character of the fragrance. Finally, the base notes linger the longest, forming the deep, lasting identity of the scent. Creating these combinations requires both science and artistry. Perfume houses experiment with hundreds of natural and synthetic ingredients. Some scents still come from traditional sources such as roses, jasmine, sandalwood, or citrus. Others are produced in laboratories, allowing perfumers to create aromas that nature alone could never provide. Cities like Grasse remain important centres of fragrance production, continuing traditions that stretch back centuries. Fields of flowers still bloom there each year, supplying perfumers with raw materials for some of the world's most famous scents. Yet perfume today is not only about luxury. Fragrance appears in soaps, candles, cosmetics, cleaning products, and countless everyday items. Scent shapes how homes smell, how stores attract customers, and how individuals express their personalities. Despite these modern uses, perfume still carries a hint of mystery. Just as ancient priests once filled temples with incense to honor their gods, people today use fragrance to create atmosphere, identity, and emotion. The materials may have changed, and the bottles may be more elegant, but the purpose remains surprisingly familiar. Perfume is an invisible language. Through scent, humans communicate beauty, memory, culture, and desire, without ever speaking a word.